I think most people in the States, they may not understand yet that we're one of the headlines, and this might be driven largely from the political cycle that hopefully we are going to be peacefully working our way through in the next few
Hmm.
weeks. I am hoping at such a deep level that I can log on to social media platforms and hear about something other than elections or thoughts on politicians. Or I'm
Yeah,
hopeful,
yeah,
but I'm also not optimistic. I'll just put it that way. Um, One of the things that people or articles and candidates have talked about is Colorado. And again, because
hmm,
of my poor ability to pronounce the TDA in Colorado, specifically a housing complex. And I definitely want to get to that, but I wanted to tie to or link to people so that they know we're not just talking about something here in Venezuela. This is actually a likely an offshoot, and I'll rely on you to kind of describe how that happened of a gang that did start in Venezuela. So this has trickled its way all the way across, like you said, Latin America and into the United States, it would seem.
yeah. It's got echoes of MS-13 and then the kind of Salvadoran street gangs in the way that it kind of makes its name in those from sort of 6, 7 years ago until now. So these guys, they kind of spread. Venezuela, as we know, is like a crumbling economy. It's kind of incredibly sad story, really. They have like some of the largest proven oil reserves on earth, but they just don't make any money, and a horrible sort of autocracy going on there. So this gang sort of spreads into neighboring Colombia and tries to take over some of the narco routes along that way. But it doesn't manage to do it because these are routes controlled by gangs who are far more powerful, far more violent. You know, you've got the former FARC rebels in Colombia who are controlling large swathes of that anyway. So they don't manage to do that. But what they do make money from is migration. So they huge smuggling industry on these porous borders in the edge of the Amazon. And so the Araguans, they make a huge amount of money from this, and obviously some of them also filter north from there as well. So this is when you hear of them. They get big in. So strangely, they get big in Chile as well. They've got quite a presence there, and then kind of more affluent Latin American nations. But they are in the States for sure.
Mhm.
Um, the question is, how embedded are they? It's very hard to parse the media story right now because I mean some of it's pretty shoddy reporting, in my opinion. I mean, I've
Yeah.
seen stuff in the New York Post, for example, that kind of from one day to the next says they're nothing or they're everything or they have tattoos signifiers, they don't have tattoo signifiers. Either one of these is supposed to be scary because we either don't know who they are or we do know who they are. They're in migration centers, they're not. Um, so when I was researching the group, I found quite a lot of discrepancies in the media reportage about them. Um, I think the kind of TLDR is they are present, but they're not as present as the media and some sides of the political divide are making out. It's kind of it's a very easy boogeyman because
Yeah.
they're a violent street gang, but they are not in any way as powerful as pretty much any other gang operating in the US at the moment. What they are doing is pretty horrible crimes, right? So because they're because they made their name in migration, they tend to do a lot of sort of sexual violence, crimes against migrants, um, really kind of low level street thuggery. I mean, there's guys, they have this almost pathological hatred of the cops, despite the cops not having sort of prosecuted them for years. So ex-Venezuelan cops who are now living in, I think a lot are living in Florida. I think that's also happening in Colorado. They've been targeted and murdered by members of this gang. There was a guy in Miami who was dragged from his house and beaten to death in his truck. That was quite recently. All of this is quite new. I mean,
Mhm.
these are very new stories. It's very fresh, and they're running kind of pimping rings in various cities around the US. That's probably that's probably where the most worrying, the most kind of low grade stuff is going on in these sort of sexual exploitation rings that the gang is running. Um, but yeah, you do hear these kind of very outlandish stories about them taking over entire, apartment blocks or migrant centers in New York City. Um, I
Have you
don't
been able to
think.
separate the wheat from the chaff on that? How much truth? And again, this will be tough for you, even as a journalist, if you're only looking at other journalists' material and their product. It's a weird time right now because people are weaponizing information for sure. And I say that
Yeah.
equally across the board. The left says only the right's doing it. The right says only the left is doing it. Maybe we could be reasonable people and say that everybody seems to be doing it.
Hmm.
But in an
Yeah.
environment where that is the currency, how in the hell do you determine a fake bill from a real bill? It's tough.
It's very tough. I would say that like one outlet that I've been really annoyed by is the New York Post. They've done some really kind of stuff that cannot be true. I mean, like I was just saying, I was reading articles from one day to the next that completely contradicted each other by different freelancers or stringers or whoever. It's like this. So one cannot be true. So why are you publishing both of these stories? Like they're either not present or they've taken over the city. Like neither of these is the truth. There is a fantastic outlet that I always come back to called Insight Crime. They do reports, they do like backstories on these groups in Latin America. They've probably had the best kind of summations of where the Araguans are right now,
Mhm.
which is that they work in very small pockets in major cities across North America. And their biggest kind of money earner is migration still. I mean, the numbers the numbers coming out of Venezuela are insane. I mean, they've lost like over 6 million people. Some estimates,
They've
I think,
lost over
that
6 million people.
yeah, yeah, and some experts think they're going to lose up to 40% of their population after this latest sham election they had. That surprise, surprise, the leftist revolution won again.
Yeah.
Um,
So are people
so
just fleeing, or are we talking that the TDA is actually removing people from this country?
both. So
Okay.
they people are fleeing. The gang is helping them do so for huge markups. Obviously, you know they're it's where smuggling and trafficking kind of overlaps. There's some there's some uncertainty as to how willing these people are to pay huge amounts of money to get out of the country. Um, and yeah, it's not getting any better, and that means that this group is probably going to grow in size and embed itself more in American cities. Um, but they don't really get involved in the narcotics trade, which is what the vast majority of street gangs seem to be making their money from. So it is hard to pass the information. It really is because you do get conflicting stories from one day to the next. But they're definitely in the States for sure, and they're operating on a bigger level.
You mentioned both of the places where I actually have some show notes in front of me. One was the apartment buildings in Colorado.
Mm.
Um, to the best of your knowledge, what is actually going on there? Because again, depending on what outlet you listen to, one, they have completely fortified this apartment complex and they are essentially, my words, not necessarily anybody else's, extorting the people that live there.
Hmm.
And then other people are saying, no, that story isn't true. We may have some people that are loosely associated with this organization, but it's nowhere near what it is being portrayed as.
I think it's I think it's more on the side of the latter. I don't think that gangs are doing that in the States. I think the gangs are doing that elsewhere outside the country.
Mm-hmm.
They are extorting people for sure. They're doing that. But the idea they could take over an entire apartment block in an American city, I think that's quite far-fetched. I don't think they have that power. They're violent, sure, but you know, there are other gangs that are far more violent present in America, and they're not on that scale. They're
Yeah.
scary, but they're not on that scale. And the worrying signs are the kind of net migration from Venezuela. And something I didn't mention before is that because Venezuela and the US are nominally enemies, they don't share data in who's coming over or who's been lost. And because, you know, Venezuela is in this perpetual state of revolution, they don't take people back. There's no extradition. There's nothing like that. So it's just a dark zone. Who's coming over? Who's getting out of Venezuela? The Venezuelans don't want to share that information. The Americans can't get it. So that's where a big problem arises, is just a lack of information. And I think that's playing out in the media to some extent.
So somebody from Venezuela who is, for whatever reason, starts interfacing with a federal system and they determine that they need to be exported or returned home, they can't go back to Venezuela. How does the United States deal with that?
Well, quite. It's not so easy to deal with, and you see like a massive backlog of in centers across the country because it is really hard. It's like they're effectively refugees. I mean, they've come from a
Hmm.
country that the US has designated as essentially as on the same similar level as a war zone. I mean, it sanctions the country to the nth degree. So if it makes that statement about Venezuela, then what can it do to to send people back? Because they are technically then fleeing, you know, a hardship that you can't just send them back. So that makes it legally difficult on the US side. And the Venezuelans don't want them, right? Because they're not contributing to the revolution. They're like the East Germans that fled across the Berlin Wall. You know, once they left, they're no longer communists or whatever. So it's just like it's a real, it's a shitstorm. It really is. It really
Yeah.
works to no one's benefit on either side.
So, do you have any idea what the U.S. currently does or what the policy is? If they're not willing to send them back to Venezuela, what do they do with these individuals? Do they send them to a different country?
Well, I don't know a lot about that, but I think at the moment it's just a backlog. There just really is just
Or they
a
don't really do
bottleneck
much of anything.
of
Yeah.
bureaucracy. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. There's not a lot going on, and because there's an election coming up, no one really wants to prod that hornet's nest. You know, one side doesn't want to admit there's a problem. The other side would like to keep the problem as loud as it can. So
Yeah.
no one really wants to figure out what's going on here, and I don't think we're going to find out a huge amount in the next sort of month or so as things, like you say, hopefully transition to a new period in peace.
Like I said, hopeful but not optimistic.